Jane fell for a charismatic guru who claimed he could heal his followers.
There was nothing that threatening when you first met them. They just looked like a group of friends.
Today, Mohan Singh is serving a long sentence for sex crimes, and Jane wonders how she fell for his patter. Barbara Weed's teenage son walked out on his family, influenced, she believed, by an online group and its controversial founder.
He convinces people quite quickly that they have been a victim of abuse, that their parents never loved them, they were always mistreated.
And when Lizzie Davis joined a spiritual retreat, she was persuaded to hand over more than £600,000.
No person in their right mind is actually going to do what I did. I wasn't in my right mind.
To some critics, groups like these are really cults. But
one person's cult is somebody else's new religious movement.
So how can you tell whether you're at risk?
There's no such thing as a free lunch. So if everyone is loving you and they've never even met you before, that could be a warning sign.
And how hard is it to get out?
You have no money, you have no friends, you have to remake your relationship with your family, and it becomes almost impossible, sometimes for years, for people to break away from that situation.
We hear the frightening stories of people whose lives have been turned upside down and who believe they or their loved ones have been trapped in a cult.
Listening to somebody do that to my son.
Barbara Weed last saw her youngest son, Tom, when he was 18. Overnight, he cut all ties with his entire family. Tom had become involved in an online discussion group called Free Domain Radio, hosted by its charismatic founder, Stefan Molyneux.
Sadly, I've never known Tom as an adult, because I haven't seen him for 6 years.
Tom upped and left with no warning just before he was about to sit his A-levels.
I came home from work that night and found a note that he'd put through the door, and I actually kept it. The note was torn out of a school exercise book and written in his blue cartridge pen, because he always had to have blue ink cartridges. The note said, "Dear family, I need to take an indefinite amount of time out from the family, so I've moved in with a friend. Please do not contact me. Tom." His father came home from work and I said, "Tom's gone," and he didn't believe me, and I showed him the note and he still didn't believe me, and went off to check his room, and sure enough, all the boxes were gone, his things were gone, his keys were on his desk. His computer was gone. He'd taken that with him.
Tom's dad was equally shocked by his disappearance.
There was no warning, so I remember very little about kind of what that was all about, except it was just a day like any other day, except that that happened.
Barbara discovered that Tom was still attending school, but she made the tough decision not to contact her son to give him space. Instead, she began going over and over his recent behaviour.
He seemed more distant, distracted, detached. He wasn't even coming down for meals anymore. He wanted to cook his own food. He was vegetarian, then he was vegan. I just assumed that he was just going through the normal grumpy teenager phase as far as I knew.
Like many normal teenagers, Tom also spent hours online.
He had homework to do. He had a computer in his room to help with his homework, and he used that for his social life.
But much of Tom's time was also being spent on the website of Free Domain Radio, an online philosophical group founded by a charismatic Canadian, Stefan Molyneux. Molyneux has a provocative and confrontational style.
If you support me getting shot, at least have the courage, the balls, to look me in the eye and say, "Steph, I support you getting shot. And then I can get you the fuck out of my life."
The online Free Domain Radio group claims to be the largest and most popular group of its kind, with over 100 million downloads. On his personal YouTube channel, Stefan Molyneux has over 235,000 subscribers. Subjects discussed include everything from homosexuality and abortion to why democracy fails and whether feminists are evil. While Tom had been safely upstairs at home, Barbara hadn't given much thought to Free Domain Radio.
I could hear Molyneux's voice coming from Tom's room. I couldn't hear what was being said. It was through a bedroom door. And I thought it was part of his homework. What I didn't realise was that he was wading through over 1,000 podcasts by Molyneux.
Once Tom had abandoned his family, Free Domain Radio took on greater significance to Barbara, and she decided to take a closer look at it.
I thought of the voice coming through his wall, and I looked at the website. I saw that other people were being very critical of their family.
She was on the internet day and night trying to find out about Molyneux, so of course I kind of did the same thing.
I needed to know what Tom had been involved in to try and understand what was going on in his mind, what he was feeling, what he was saying.
As Barbara waded through Free Domain Radio's forums and podcasts, she made a heartbreaking discovery. She came across the actual voice of her own son, clearly in an emotional state.
I don't know why, but I'm just crying now.
There's nothing wrong with that. This is a good and healthy thing.
Such complete sadness.
Rena Denton may not look like your average guru.
I saw no warning signs when I first met her because she was Mrs. Denton. She was this rather frumpy, unimpressive, comely, warm, quite charming sometimes, even a sense of humour.
But she is the guru and spiritual head of the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre based in Somerset.
When you have a relationship between a spiritual leader and a disciple, there is such a balance of power here, because it can just be abused.
Lizzie Davis claims Mrs. Denton persuaded her to give hundreds of thousands of pounds to her healing centre.
This is a picture of Mrs. Denton, who's then our guru, Yogananda, with my husband.
Lizzie had always had an interest in the spiritual side of life, something she shared with her husband. Around 1991, the couple decided to commit their lives to their passion.
Lizzie's husband was based in Bristol, where he was studying to be a doctor, and they'd rented out, she had 2 flats in London, they'd rented those out, and she'd moved down to Bristol. Her mother had died as well, and they had decided that they wanted to devote their life to healing, to helping people. They wanted to set up a healing centre.
Their dream was to open a centre offering a range of therapies, workshops, and events. Integral to it all was spiritual healing. But Lizzie and her husband wanted to get some experience first, so they accepted an offer to spend time with Rena Denton, who had a healing centre in a picturesque old farmhouse in Somerset.
The plan that I had with my husband that we had together was that we would train at the centre together in all of the healing trainings, and then we were going to set up a centre of our own. We had sold 3 properties. I had 2 in London, my husband had 1 in Bristol, and we had moved into rented accommodation near the centre in order to train, whilst we property hunted.
For the next few months, Lizzie and her husband attended the centre daily, not only seeing how it was run, but also taking part in yoga, meditation, and spiritual healing. Central to everything there was Mrs. Denton, who describes herself as a guru and calls herself Mata Yogananda Mahasaya Dharma.
There was something about her presence that had this kind of hypnotic effect on people. I felt destabilized.
And in a matter of months, Lizzie's dreams of her own healing centre would vanish and her marriage would collapse. When Barbara Weed's 18-year-old son Tom suddenly walked out on the family, she was shocked to discover that he'd been talking directly to Stefan Molyneux, the charismatic founder of an online group called Free Domain Radio. Barbara felt Molyneux's controversial views had strongly influenced Tom.
The complicity of mothers is the core of child abuse. Mothers create that.
God, that is just sick beyond words.
Even now, it's really shocking to listen to the podcast and hear my son talking and asking quite innocent, reasonable questions. Why do I feel so upset when I see animals being mistreated? And then within a couple of sentences, Molyneux was convincing him that not just he had seen animals being mistreated because his cats were yelled at, but he was treated like an animal. He was a victim of abuse.
I think that you, when you were a child, were treated like an animal by somebody who was cruel to animals. I think that the compassion you have towards animals, which I respect and I think is a good thing to have, but I think that it's a stand-in for something that's harder for you to face, which is how you were treated.
Times journalist Tom Whipple investigated the story just after Tom disappeared and was also struck by Molyneux's conversations with Tom.
It felt a little bit like listening to a fortune teller kind of priming people. And after phoning in to hear veganism meant he had a problem with people who eat meat, it was suddenly on to the fact that his dad had kicked a cat once, which both psychologically explained that whole thing with veganism and also might mean that he needs to leave his family.
As Barbara had researched Free Domain Radio more, she had discovered that one topic of discussion for the group was the cutting of ties with family, or defooing.
According to Molyneux, the relationship with the parent and the child is abusive. The child doesn't have any choice because of the unequal power relationship between the parent and the child.
This is why I say to people, if your parents are evil, ditch them.
Professor Rod Dubrow-Marshall sees Free Domain Radio's defooing as a potentially harmful influence.
FDR indoctrinate people into thinking that they have to defoo, have to cut themselves off from their family, because if they don't, they are never going to be psychologically well or healthy. It makes them actually psychologically unhealthy because they're not able to grow and develop. They're not able to talk to their parents about their experiences. They actually become instead totally dominated by the guru and the leader in a very unhealthy way.
Molyneux said in a newspaper interview in 2008 that it's rare for people to actually defoo, although he and his wife have both done it. And he admits he doesn't believe there are any good parents out there. When Tom was chatting online with Molyneux, his father, John, became the focus of attention. Tom told Molyneux his parents used to kick the family cat.
I've got so many memories of my parents just screaming at my cats and kicking them. And I mean, I wouldn't say they're particularly more abusive towards animals than I'd say most people are.
Then Tom went on to accuse his father of anger issues, although he was clear he was never violent towards Tom himself.
When he'd get really mad, he'd just yell and he'd throw things around the room. He could trash a room in like 15 seconds almost.
What you went through is a really staggeringly evil and terrifying situation, right? That this guy's psychotic rage laid waste to significant aspects of your childhood and of your soul, right?
Tom was sobbing, and he believed that he had been mistreated as a child.
Something that went on and on throughout your entire childhood, and I would imagine continues to this day.
You're right. Whenever he walks in the room, I just feel the same feeling. It just comes right back to me.
Tom's father, John, has never been able to bring himself to listen to the podcast, but he categorically denies ever kicking the cat, having anger issues, or trashing a room.
It horrified me to think that I could be thought of in that way. Yeah, I'm moody occasionally, but not violent. not those things.
Listening to somebody do that to my son, it would be like watching somebody kicking and beating him on a newsreel. Why would anybody do that to my son? Sorry.
Why would Tom make such accusations? His dad thinks it may have been because his marriage to Tom's mum was failing.
Barbara and I had rows, yes, and they were rows for reasons. And I tried anything to get through all the worst things, which is shouting and whatever. So if Tom picked up on that, he picked up on that.
Barbara is in no doubt that Stefan Molyneux was the reason Tom left.
He convinces people quite quickly that they have been a victim of abuse, that their parents never loved them, they were always mistreated.
Tom still wouldn't talk to his mum, but 6 months after leaving, he did agree to talk with Times journalist Tom Whipple.
The obvious interview was to speak to Tom, who agreed to speak to me on condition that also Stefan Molyneux, who runs the website Free Domain Radio, was part of the interview as well. And in 2 hours of interviews, I still didn't understand it with him. There wasn't the abuse that I would expect to just, on apparently a whim, give up on a 20-year relationship with the person who knows you the best. And frankly, although he'd be uncomfortable with someone saying this and was uncomfortable when I said it, quite clearly loves him the most.
It was clear to Tom Whipple that Free Domain Radio and Stefan Molyneux played a big part in Tom's life, although Tom went to great lengths to say he hadn't been unduly influenced.
The only time Tom seemed angry to me was at the idea that he was being manipulated. It felt odd that he insisted that when I interviewed him, it was only with the presence of Stefan. I think the most significant relationship in Tom's life, at least when I spoke to him, certainly was FDR. It was certainly Free Domain Radio.
In the early 1990s, Lizzie Davis and her husband were enthusiastic visitors at the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre in Somerset, run by Rena Denton. They hoped to learn the ropes while looking for a spiritual centre of their own. After months of regularly attending the centre, Lizzie found their dream place. But Lizzie claims Rena Denton intervened when she found out and encouraged them to move full-time into her centre instead.
You, Lizzie, have a great contribution to make to the centre. Oh, we're really looking forward to you coming. And she was saying to my husband that perhaps I didn't have the... I wasn't ready to, run a centre of my own or whatever.
Lizzie was probably vulnerable. Her mother had died a few months before she met Mrs. Denton, as she then was. Maybe she was vulnerable, looking for a mother figure.
In September 1992, Lizzie and her husband took up the offer to move into the centre and become part of Self-Realization's inner circle of followers.
The Alpha Omega family, as she called it, we are a family, we live as a family. One of her favourite phrases was, a family that prays together stays together. I do have a dysfunctional family background, and now I understand, some of the reasons why I was looking for a family. I was looking for a family. And it was attractive to me, even though it was so different from anything I'd known.
At the centre, there was a strict daily regime of meditation, healing and work. And Lizzie remembers feeling cut off.
There's no radio, there's no television, there's no newspapers, there's no phone calls to friends, there's no contact with family. Sundays that they would be sent in silence. So I wasn't even able to talk to my husband anymore. So literally you become, it's like you're owned.
Lizzie's experiences show how groups that are potentially more harmful seek to separate loved ones from each other once they're recruited, but also the importance of communal living, because in that context, the guru, the leader, can more effectively control the member.
Lizzie struggled to adapt to living in the centre, but believing that Rena Denton, who is also known as Meta Yogananda, had a higher calling, she blamed herself.
By that time, as bizarre as it sounds, by that time I really believed that this woman was part of, and I'm going to say it in this way, like following Gandhi. I believe that if I devoted myself to it and changed myself and became this supposedly humble person, I would be a better person.
A mutual friend of ours phoned me and flagged up a lot of worries, and she said, I'm really concerned about what's going on. She's not seeing so much of her husband. It feels as though they're being separated in some way, and she doesn't feel good about herself. She's not happy, and she's losing confidence, and she's feeling very uneasy. And I said, well, she's a grown woman, and, if she doesn't like it, she'll leave.
But it wouldn't be until months later that Lizzie, believing she was almost penniless, would eventually leave Rena Denton and her self-realization group. Jane, who's chosen not to use her real name, met self-appointed guru Mohan Singh in the late 1990s. She fell so completely under his spell, she handed over thousands of pounds, ended up in hospital, and she's still haunted by him.
There's always the fear at the back of my mind that he might try and get some form of revenge on me, yes.
For over a decade at the turn of the millennium, Mohan Singh, whose real name is Michael Lyons, led a spiritual group that spanned from London to Manchester and even the USA. Singh convinced his followers he was a mystic and then used his charms to manipulate his many female followers, sexually and financially. They funded his lavish lifestyle and introduced him to new potential victims. And then in 2010, Singh was jailed for 10 years after being found guilty of a rape and a sexual assault. Jane first met Singh at a spiritual retreat and soon confided in him she was on medication after a nervous breakdown.
He came up to me and offered me some kind of osteopathic adjustment. He told me that I was psychologically addicted to this medication and I should stop taking it. He did also bring out this white powder. Suddenly, it sort of came out of nowhere. It looked like he'd miraculously produced this powder. And he put it on my forehead and said he had healed me.
According to Amanda Van Eck from the Information Network on Religious Movements, Singh had developed a reputation for his spiritual powers.
Mohan presented himself as a spiritual person. There was talk of him being a chiropractor, an osteopath, but also a healer with amazing powers.
Jane was new to London and didn't know many people there. She was quickly drawn into Mohan Singh's group. As the self-appointed leader, Singh promoted himself as a higher power.
He would get out this incense and start blowing this incense all over the place and say he was purifying us because we were impure and we had to be made pure and all this kind of stuff. He would kind of compare himself with Christ, and I remember one time he said to me, I don't know why I'm spending so much time with you because you're going to crucify me just like you crucified Jesus. So this was the kind of language that he used. And he thought of himself as Jesus.
Jane found out later that Singh was having sex with some of his followers.
They would do all this dancing and the very kind of uninhibited dancing, and he said that this was very good for them, and I began to see more and more as much more kind of sexual.
Amanda Van Eck would later be approached by a number of women with grievances about Singh's behaviour.
Most of the complaints in regards to Mohan Singh were of a sexual nature. there was a strong sexual element to the lifestyle and the beliefs. It was usually a constant whirl of let's go get some Chinese herbs, let's go get some treatment, let's go to a sauna, and then end up again in a flat. And then Mohan would offer healing. And I think in quite a few cases of healing, some women in hindsight felt that they were sexually abused.
Jane wasn't a target of Singh's sexual advances. But like most of his followers, she was helping to fund Mohan Singh's lavish lifestyle that included trips to Paris and LA, expensive shoes, and meals out.
He would walk around with all this cash, and the girls around him were incredibly shabbily dressed, always had no money at all, because I think he asked them for 40% of their earnings or something, and on top of that, he would just ask them to buy things. That particular girl, he would just use her telephone for all his international calls, and she was stuck with the bill, and so he never paid for anything.
Over the course of the next few months, Jane handed over thousands of pounds. She even paid for the group to go on one of its many trips to the USA.
I was just weak, I suppose, and I went and gave them a cheque for all the tickets, and of course Mohan never repaid me, even though I asked him several times for the money.
But it was on Jane's mental health that Mohan's influence was most devastating. Believing in his healing powers, Jane had given up her medication.
I came off the medication because Mohan specifically told me that I was psychologically addicted to it, and he had now healed me, so I didn't need it anymore.
The reality was a dangerous deterioration in Jane's mental health.
I was slowly not in control of my own mind because I couldn't understand what was happening in my own mind. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I didn't know why I wasn't thinking clearly. I think I was clinging onto them because I didn't know what else to hold on to at that point. When I did finally break down, when I was really ill, he said to me something like, "Nobody can help you now, not even God can help you."
It was only when Jane disagreed with Singh she finally managed to break free of his control.
How it ended was I said something which was critical, and he hit me really hard on the face. And I've never been hit by anyone before, and it gave me a real shock, and that's when I left and I never went back.
In the early 1990s, Lizzie Davis and her husband had put their plans to set up their own healing centre on hold. Instead, they were persuaded to move into Rena Denton's Spiritual Healing Centre and become part of its inner circle, or Alpha Omega family. But all Alpha Omega members had to give up all their monies and goods. For Lizzie and her husband, that would include the hundreds of thousands of pounds they'd set aside for their own centre.
We were told that it was the same for all the inner circle, that you gave everything. You surrendered your entire worldly wealth. Well, these were people who had nothing to begin with anyway, most of them.
Lizzie was reluctant to give away all the couple's money and instead offered a donation and a loan.
I offered a £5,000 donation initially and a £50,000 interest-free loan.
But Mrs. Denton told her it was all or nothing if you wanted to join the inner circle.
You can only attain self-realization if you surrender entirely to the spiritual plane. This is the way that God moves through you. You, Lizzie, with your background of having had money, you've been spoiled, you've been this, you've been that. And within, I think it was 6 weeks, I'd signed over investments and the sale of the proceeds of 2 homes, which were my homes.
Lizzie and her husband got legal advice, and her lawyer advised her strongly not to sign. But Lizzie did.
No person in their right mind is actually going to do what I did. I wasn't in my right mind. I believed that the people in the material world were evil, that my financial advisor and my lawyer would do everything in their power to dissuade me from this noble act that I had to do in order to realize the path that I was on, the spiritual path. So as an act of will, I had to not listen to their advice.
Lizzie and her husband also agreed to pay £5,000 for a world tour for Mr. and Mrs. Denton to spread the message of the centre's work. Lizzie and her husband had already planned a world trip of their own before they settled into life at the centre. During their trip, they met the Dentons in New Zealand, and Lizzie heard surprising news.
I was told that the money had been used for her to buy a centre in Australia. Guess who was going to run the centre? Her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend. And when I said, you're going to turn that into a healing centre, I said, your daughter isn't even trained in healing. She said, oh, I trained her. I couldn't believe it.
Mrs. Denton insists Lizzie and her husband were delighted about the Australian centre. Lizzie disputes this. Even so, she continued to follow Mrs. Denton.
If you really believe that somebody is holy and self-realised, you can't ask questions because doubt is out. You ask a question, you're not trusting God.
The way in which Lizzie recounts how she was sucked into that environment is quite common to a number of self-help organisations that are around. They all have this leader who is a self-appointed guru who claims to have high levels of spiritual awareness, when actually, when the people get to know them better, they may be rather disappointed.
Lizzie returned to the centre in Somerset. But once back in the UK, her relationship with her guru deteriorated.
Now she had, £700,000 and I had absolutely nothing. I was working for £25 a week. So now I am put on kitchen duty.
Eventually, Lizzie made the emotional decision to leave. She says Mrs. Denton reacted angrily, although this is denied by Rena Denton.
She told me when I said I was leaving, you will never exist in the outside world. You will take drugs, you will have a breakdown, and you don't exist without me. The scales had fallen from my eyes.
For some people, there is this moment of realization where the reality is actually what I'm looking at, and it becomes crystal clear in a very quick moment.
Although Lizzie had decided to leave the healing centre, her husband chose to stay behind.
It was the most agonising decision. I'd married very late in life. I was 42. I was very deeply in love. I was deeply committed to my marriage because I saw it as a spiritual union, as people do, and I was very dedicated to him.
Lizzie ended up walking out alone and feeling desperate.
You've got £40 to your name. You're leaving the man you love. You have no possessions. You have no home. Who the hell do you, where do you turn?
She was so afraid at that point, afraid of losing her sanity completely. She felt really unbalanced, and she just, she talks about it as she just made a run for it, basically. She managed to get somebody, I don't think it was somebody she even knew particularly well, to just be at the bottom of the drive with the car at a particular time and just ran because she was afraid they'd stop her going.
Lizzie's friend Shirley remembers seeing her for the first time after she had left the centre.
She came through the door of my house with 2 plastic carrier bags with all her possessions in. And she was shaky. She was disempowered, dispossessed, distressed. She had nothing.
Although the centre paid Lizzie some money for her immediate needs, she consulted lawyers. Eventually, she decided to take the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre to court to get the rest of her money back. To Lizzie's amazement, her own husband was actively involved in the Self-Realization Centre's defence.
He got all these people at the centre to testify on paper against Lizanne, and he phoned me. And I will never forget that when I answered the phone. I can't emphasise how strange his voice was, all sort of floaty and weird. And I just want to come round and talk to you about Lizzie. And I said, I know what you're doing. You're trying to get her friends to testify against her. This is still your wife, This is Lizzie.
It would take a lengthy legal battle before Lizzie could start to rebuild her life.
Initially, we gave them the opportunity of settling out of court, which they refused to do. We ended up bringing a case for undue influence against them. By this time, everybody I knew at the centre had actually sworn witness statements against me, including my husband. It was a long battle. It was a very long battle.
Lizzie settled out of court for £690,000, getting back what she had lost. The centre did not admit liability.
Then my husband divorced me, and of course I had to come to a settlement with him where some of the money went back to him.
Some years later, Lizzie's husband himself would leave the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre. Eventually, he tried to bring his own case of undue influence against them. His case was dismissed because he'd taken too long to bring the claim. Next, Barbara Weed still hoped to save her relationship with her youngest son, but she faced a desperate battle.
He just shook his head and looked at me as if to say, "Fool."
Jane had been so overawed by charismatic guru Mohan Singh, she'd even stopped taking antidepressants when he told her to. But when Singh hit her, she immediately left. Having broken away from his group, Jane succumbed to a mental breakdown. While she was in hospital, she finally saw the light.
When I came out of there, after about 6 months, I was well again. And I then looked back over the whole thing and realized how much money I had given him.
What followed for Jane was months of recovery and years of unsuccessfully trying to get back the thousands of pounds she'd given to Singh.
I sent him a letter detailing everything that had happened as I remembered it, and the various amounts of money that I had given him, but I ended up in the end having paid something like £13,000.
But it wouldn't be until allegations of sexual abuse and assault emerged years later that she would finally see Mohan Singh face some kind of justice.
What came up was that actually there'd been at least 4 other women in this country who had reported Mohan for rape. So that's when it all began to come together.
Mohan Singh was sentenced in 2010 to 7 years for rape and a further 3 for sexual assault. He was acquitted on 4 other counts of rape.
I think the judge put it very well when he said this is a betrayal of women by women, because very cleverly what Mohan did was he used women to do his dirty work for him, and women usually will trust another woman. It wasn't like he went up to them. So when you're approached by a woman, you don't expect that, you're being entrapped in the same way.
But as Amanda Van Eck from the Information Network on Religious Movements points out, the power of a charismatic leader can be so strong, prison is no barrier.
He's a convicted rapist. He's in prison. But there's still a community of people out there who think that he is a messiah and he is a spiritual leader who is misunderstood by society and who has been wronged. It's important to understand that believers can see something in a completely different way from you or I.
Though Mohan Singh is still behind bars, Jane is afraid of what may happen when he finally gets out.
I hope that he doesn't decide to take out any anger on me and or on anybody else, and I really hope that he doesn't carry on with his activities just as before. I suspect that a lot of his inner circle are just waiting for him to come out.
Barbara Weed was faced with never seeing her 18-year-old son Tom again after he had got involved with the online group Free Domain Radio and its founder Stefan Molyneux.
This is why I say to people, if your parents are evil, ditch them.
Tom had followed Stefan's advice and in the summer of 2008 cut all ties with his family.
He left home in the middle of his A-levels. He cut himself off from his family. That's not because his family wouldn't want to give him support.
Barbara was determined not to give up on her son. When after a few weeks she found out Tom was working in a cafe, she made plans to go and see him.
I knew that if I went up to him and asked for a cup of tea, he would have to serve me because I was a customer and he couldn't refuse. And sure enough, that's what happened. So I'd worked out that I would have, 20 seconds, maybe a minute, to speak to him, to say what I wanted to say while he was making the tea and taking the money from me. And then after that, he'd be able to, he'd have finished serving me, he could walk away. His job was done.
Barbara's plan started well. She managed to speak to Tom, but she was left distraught by their brief interaction.
I did also say that he could come back any time, even in 20 years, and he'd be very welcome. And he just shook his head. He didn't speak. He just shook his head and looked at me as if to say, "You fool." That's the last time I spoke to him.
Barbara's story is sadly very typical of the experience of parents who have lost their loved ones to cults, where they suddenly get a letter saying, "I'm disappearing, I don't want to talk to you anymore." And it's the way in which cults break up families, the way in which cults harm people psychologically by expecting their members to split themselves from their families in that way.
We approached Free Domain Radio for a response to the allegations made in this programme. Stefan Molyneux did not respond, but he has previously denied that Free Domain Radio is a cult. Speaking to a newspaper about Tom's story, he said, "It's the furthest thing from a cult." 6 years on, Barbara knows little about what her youngest son is doing, other than that he might be living in Brighton.
I'm not going to look for him today. I wouldn't know where to find him anyway. And the chances of ever seeing him again are so minimal. And there'd be no point, because he hates me. He will always hate me, because that's what Molyneux has trained him to do. He won't want to see me.
Tom's parents were, and I think are, distraught. It's left them trying to reassess much of their life with Tom, thinking about these snatched conversations and rows that he appears to have interpreted in ways that they didn't interpret.
He's still in my life. He's the ghost in a room. He's... a lot of my life is finding out about cults. On the internet, on Twitter. That's my preoccupation. Trying to understand and trying to share information about cults, because this is just one. To parents, I'd say, if you notice your child's behaviour changing, child or of any age, anyone that you care for, if you notice their behaviour's changing, they're cutting themselves off from people that used to be their friends, try and talk to them, find out exactly what they're involved in. Find out as much about that as you can. It may be some religion they got caught up in, it may be a gang, it could be drugs, but it could be a cult.
Rena Denton disputes all of Lizzie's allegations and points out that Lizzie's involvement with the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre happened a long time ago. She says that members of the centre are not isolated or trapped, they lead normal lives. Mrs. Denton also says that Lizzie knew what joining the centre would entail, and she was not pressured into handing over money. She adds she had no idea how much money Lizzie had when she joined, and she doesn't agree Lizzie was homeless at the time she left the centre. Mrs. Denton says that the Self-Realization Meditation Healing Centre has been cleared of any wrongdoing. She does not accept that the centre can be described as a cult, and says that members are empowered to make their own decisions.
Now, when Katie Price has shared her life on the telly in the past, it's been under her control, not tomorrow night when she really opens up to Channel 5. Katie Price in Therapy is brand new at 9. There's a little peek next. Then the cyber war is on. in a new Person of Interest double bill, the season finale.